Welcome, everyone, to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time I ended the Battle of Boydton Plank Road. Now I moved the Siege of Petersburg into the last winter of the war, telling the stories of the soldiers stuck in the trenches as they awaited orders to attack. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. The fight for the Boydton Plank Road in late October 1864 signaled the last of the major fighting during the Siege of Petersburg in that year. Both sides settled in for a cold and brutal winter, full of frostbite and sharpshooter bullets, both maiming and killing soldiers as they manned the earthworks surrounding Petersburg. In the city, the crime rate was up. A newspaper explained, "I would advise all soldiers who arrive with packages entrusted to their care to keep their eyes wide open, and if any should be so unfortunate as to have gold plugs in their teeth, be sure and keep the latter tightly closed, if they desire to retain their masticators." Wagons loaded down with food would be waylaid by highwaymen and citizens just looking for food. The supplies that came into the city went for exorbitant prices. One lady wrote, "With all our starvation, we never ate rats, mice, or mule meat. We managed to exist on peas, bread, sorghum. We could buy a little milk, and we fixed it with a drink made from roasted and ground corn. The latter, in the grain, was scarce." At the town market, a newspaper reported, "Here, mingling in one promiscuous, struggling, seething mass, may be seen the old and the young, the grave and the gay, the married and single, black and white, bond and free, male and female, soldier and civilian, beautiful young maidens and buxom matrons, all intent on the one very important object of procuring something to comfort the inner man." Wood became scarce as two major armies competed with citizens in deforesting the area for fuel. Little footbridges through the city were ripped up and burned at night. Lumber had to be brought in from greater distances and sold for more extravagant prices. Petersburg's Wood Committee overspent its budget by $35,000 that winter. A patch of woods that didn't get denuded housed a water supply for some of the Federal soldiers, those who were brave enough to travel through no man's land to get into the tree line and fill his canteen. One soldier became so consumed with thirst he determined to make the journey. His friends covered him in their own empty canteens, and the poor man sprinted through the open ground, with rebel bullets kicking up dirt and whizzing about his head. He made it to the water source, filled his and his friends' canteens, and then made the fearful journey back across no man's land. Amazingly, he made it without getting hurt, but he admitted that he never made the journey again. Through that winter, the soldiers on the picket line outside the trenches seemed to have a better time than most. The two sides often came together and became cordial. A Pennsylvanian wrote, "By tacit consent, rather than by formal agreement, the pickets on both sides ceased to fire at each other in the daytime, and often saluted or conversed together like comrades or old friends." Another wrote, "The pickets soon began to fraternize with probably a greater freedom and familiarity than ever before." A Rhode Island soldier commented, "When we weren't killing each other, we were the best of friends." The November election saw Abraham Lincoln against George McClellan. Although McClellan personally didn't support negotiations to end the war, the Democratic political party did. Despite Grant's inability to capture Petersburg or Richmond, Lincoln's victory indicated that the country, and especially the soldiers, agreed with Lincoln's prosecution of the war, aided by the victories at Atlanta and in the Shenandoah Valley. Morale began to falter through the Confederacy due to the military and political losses. Troops in the Army of Northern Virginia, driven by starvation, lack of payment, and loss of belief in victory, began to desert from that once formidable army. Especially in early 1865, the loss to the army through desertion skyrocketed, and Robert E. Lee, its commander, began to worry. He wrote to President Jefferson Davis and the Secretary of War, John C. Breckinridge, that desertions had hit a critical point. Lee proposed that there be a 30-day grace period that anyone who had deserted could come back into the ranks without suffering punishment. The proposal was accepted, but it didn't help. Over the course of about 2 weeks in February, the divisions of Henry Heath and Cadmus Wilcox lost 500 men. Between February and March, 3,000 rebels ventured across no man's land and surrendered. By this point in the war, the Confederacy suffered incredible defeats, with Atlanta being captured, the near destruction of the Army of Tennessee during Hood's Tennessee campaign, and William T. Sherman's march to the sea. Many Southerners lost hope in an independent South, but the North, despite their successes in the West, despaired at the stalemate outside of Petersburg. Calls for peace negotiations echoed through the halls of government. President Abraham Lincoln, to at the very least show that he was open to negotiations, allowed Francis P. Blair Sr. to go through Confederate lines to meet with President Davis. Blair's discussion included a plan that bordered on fantasy by insisting that the way to bring the countries together was through a common threat, and he listed the French control over Mexico. This didn't impress Davis, who agreed to send peace commissioners to meet with Union emissaries. The Confederate commissioners included Vice President Alexander Stephens, John A. Campbell, the Assistant Secretary of War, and Robert Hunter, President pro tem of the Confederate Senate. The commissioners moved through the lines on January 31st, going to City Point, Virginia, where General-in-Chief Ulysses S. Grant welcomed them and provided them with food and staterooms to be comfortable. The next day, Robert E. Lee, commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, was promoted to command all Confederate forces. Lee accepted it, but admitted that he didn't have the ability or power to exert control over all the troops, plus he wouldn't leave the Army of Northern Virginia. The same day that Lee received his promotion, one of Lincoln's most trusted subordinates, Thomas T. Eckert, the superintendent of the U.S. military telegraph, met with the 3 Confederate commissioners, carrying a message from the president. The message insisted that any discussion had to begin with the following non-negotiable items. 1. Restoration of the Union. 2. Acceptance of all laws against slavery passed by the U.S. Congress. And 3. The goal of the talks to be a total, not partial, end of hostilities. The commissioners said that they were willing to meet without any agreement to those items. Eckert took that as meaning that the meeting would not take place and wired Lincoln to that effect. About 30 minutes later, Ulysses S. Grant wired the Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, telling him that he believed the commissioners were sincere about restoring peace and union. That message reached Lincoln as well, and the president decided to meet personally with the commissioners. On February 3, 1865, Abraham Lincoln and his Secretary of State William Seward sat down with the Confederate peace commissioners on board the River Queen near Fort Monroe, Virginia. After some small talk, particularly about the Capitol Dome, brought up by Hunter, who, being a former U.S. Senator, remembered that when he left in 1861 that it hadn't been finished, Seward told him it was finished and described the new dome. Finally, Stephens asked, "Well, Mr. President, is there no way of putting an end to the present trouble?" Lincoln replied, "There is but one way. Those who are resisting the law of the Union must cease their resistance." He went on to insist that the only way he would accept peace is with a restoration of the Union and an acceptance of the anti-slavery laws passed by Congress and through his executive order in the form of the Emancipation Proclamation. The two sides were at an impasse. In Lincoln's report to Congress, Lincoln wrote, "The conference ended without success." As the two sides met and failed to establish peace, Grant planned for another offensive.